In the world of medicine, we often rely on clinical trials conducted in perfect conditions. But real life is rarely perfect. There is a massive gap between how a drug performs in a lab and how it works in the body of a patient. Bridging that gap requires moving beyond occasional clinical snapshots to continuous streams of data that capture the true patient experience. Joining us to explain how we turn that patient voice into hard science is Dr. Mark Larkin. Mark is the founder and CEO of Vitaccess, a digital healthcare firm that functions as a full-service research partner. With a PhD from Cambridge and over 20 years of experience in healthcare consulting, Mark is a pioneer in using smartphone-based research to help biopharma companies and patient groups co-create evidence. He's here to talk about why patient-driven data is a necessity for medical research, how digital tools are becoming the great equalizer for geographic diversity, and how listening to patients fundamentally changes the hypotheses we test. Okay, well, Mark, it's lovely to have you on the podcast today. How's your day been so far?
It's been good, thank you. Yeah, lovely spring day where I am.
Good, glad to hear it. Okay, so as you know, we're going to start off with a quick game of ins and outs. Are you ready to get started?
I am as ready as I'll ever be. Perfect.
Great answer. Okay, letting clean laundry live in the basket instead of folding it. Oh, God. I'm a half in, half out on this one. I would say I try my best to fold the laundry after I've done it, but I also think this is one of my biggest nails on a chalkboard pet peeves. I absolutely hate folding laundry, so I would be lying if I said I didn't come victim to just leaving it in the basket for a day or two.
I would take it out of the basket, but I wouldn't fold it because life's too short.
Okay. So then we're agreed on that. Always checking GPS directions, even if you know the way. I'm out on this one. If I know the way, I actually hate with using directions because it always interrupts my music. But if I have no idea where I'm going, I am, yes, constantly staring at the directions to make sure I am going the right way.
Agreed. If you know the way, why on earth would you be checking the directions? That's pointless. I would also say that if you don't know the way, there's a game you can play to see if you can get there without the directions anyway. Up the ante, and it reduces cognitive decline, right? Keeping.
There you go. Keeps us right. Yeah, I'm historically a bit directionally challenged, so sometimes I do unfortunately have to rely on directions. But agreed, it makes life more interesting.
You know, humans have directional capability. They can tell north. Most people think that doesn't happen. People did cool experiments in the 1970s in the UK, putting people in lead-lined vans and then asking them where north is, and people responded better than chance.
Really?
Yep.
That's really interesting. Well, I also read...
It's not just birds, it's people who can do it as well.
It's people can do it as well. Because I also read the study about, I think it was actually about social media's impact on your short-term memory, but they did a study on UK taxi drivers, and they studied their brain composition and essentially how it's changed their brain driving in London for so many years. And then they
absolutely.
Also
so that's a really famous. So my academic background a long time ago was in experimental psychology. So I did a degree.
Oh, really? That's so interesting.
So these sort of learning, I was familiar with that that work. It's it's a great study where people learn in the UK. They used to have pre-GPS.
Yeah.
Taxi drivers used to have to do what was called the knowledge, essentially memorizing the street plan of London, and they
which is
they
quite
worked on having which is very difficult.
Yeah.
And the other people who are really interesting from memory are people like waiters and waitresses, because their working memory is really good. When particularly in the US, when people show off by taking their orders without writing anything down, right? But you can practice that stuff.
Yeah. No, it was fascinating. I deleted social media immediately after I read that study. This is terrifying. Okay, owning a lucky pen, coin, keychain, etc. I'm out on this one. I don't think I've ever had a lucky gadget, per se.
Yeah, I'm not lucky per se, but favorite. That's the. I mean, having a favorite pen, etc. Not coin, but it's quite nice having not that much stuff, just having one of things. Agreed.
But pen, I think pen's a big one. If I have a favorite pen, there's a specific type of pen that writes really well. And as a left-handed person, if it doesn't bleed on my hand.
Ah,
Immediate favorite.
I'm also left-handed
Oh,
and
there you go.
left-footed. There
Me
you go.
too. Yeah, it was great growing up playing football because I was always sought after being left-footed. I'm sure you had it similar if you played. Okay, having a motivational quote somewhere you've stopped noticing. Uh, no, I would say I'm out on this one. Yeah, well, embarrassing or cute, however you want to put it. But growing up, I had a little motivational quote in my mirror that was something that I had come up with, and it represented a few of my goals that I was trying to achieve when I was younger. And so I think growing up, I always used to stare at that. Well, now I don't live at home anymore, so I don't see that anymore. But I've stopped doing that. But yes, when I was younger, I did.
Yeah, I've never done that, I don't think. So, which many people might find very easy to
Maybe it's an
understand.
American thing. But, taking free hotel toiletries you'll never use. Yes, I think if something is just free, there's just something very attractive about a free thing to me, so I will tend to always take it. Yes.
Yeah, I take all of them, obviously, but not because I'll never use them. I've got kids and, well,
Oh,
actually,
there you go.
in-laws, and for years I used them as stocking fillers in addition to the stuff freebies from conferences. Obviously.
See, that reminds me, my dad when we were younger, he used to travel a bunch for work, and he used to bring us home free hotel toiletries, and I thought it was the coolest thing in the world. It was shampoo or conditioner, but
Exactly.
dad brought it back from somewhere far in the world. So,
Keeping it real.
yep. Okay, perfect. Well, that was our game. But now to dive into some of the hard hitting stuff. So, Mark, RCTs are often called the gold standard, but they operate in a vacuum. So, what are these specific gaps in our clinical knowledge that only patient driven longitudinal research can fill?
Yeah, I mean, RCTs have existed for a long time to answer questions about that regulators need to answer, so about efficacy and safety, which are great, but that's a different thing from what happens in the real world setting. So when medicines are launched, there's a whole range of questions about how they might act in the real world, what their effectiveness might be, because conditions are different from RCTs, and there's a whole range of ways that they differ. So, for instance, there's different patient groups. There might be patients that have different comorbidities. The clinical trial might actually be quite short, but people might be using them for far longer than the clinical trial. So, there's a range of questions that everyone would be interested in, not just the manufacturers, but actually patients, advocacy groups, really to understand what the impact or impacts of a treatment might be in the real world setting once it hits the market. And actually, it's not just on the patients themselves, it could be on their families, their caregivers, etc. So that's the type of work that we at Vitaccess, my company, really focus on. So doing research, real world research that's complementary to clinical trials.
That makes complete sense. So if this longitudinal data is the key to seeing how these drugs perform in the real world, the next hurdle is really getting, well, let's call it the powers to be to actually trust that data. So historically, how a patient feels was seen as subjective or dismissed as a soft metric. So how is the science evolving to make these robust enough for, say, HTA bodies and payers to actually base funding decisions on them?
Yeah, so I mean, we at Vitaccess do try and do what we think of as patient-centric, science-driven research, and we try and do that in as rigorous as way as we can. We recognise it's not, as we've just talked about, it's not RCTs, but still, there's no reason why you shouldn't try and maximise the rigour for that. And if you do that, you optimise and give yourself the best chance of it being considered by, as you said, regulators, health technology assessment bodies, etc. And there's a whole list of things that you can do really to set up your real world research as rigorously as possible. And that starts with things like making sure you have a protocol, being transparent. If you're using patient reported outcomes instruments, make sure you use validated instruments. going down to if you're doing a multi-country study, using the right instruments for the right languages in the right countries. If if you're analyzing the data, make sure you have a statistical analysis plan that you set up ahead of time. There's good practices as well on things like governance. We talk a lot about patient centricity. I mean, lots of people do, frankly. But many times there aren't. When you dig into the details of that, it's not necessarily what many people would think of as patient-centric. So in my team, we've got folks who are on patient centricity special interest group, and they do surveys of how actually people are operating, and people would say, "Oh, we did a very nice patient-centric study," but in fact, they may have only asked for some advice from patients. Actually, when the study has already been designed. So
actually, that's a patient-advised study, not a patient-centric study.
Exactly right. So if you're doing it properly, you should basically engage with your stakeholders, patients, advocates, caregivers, etc., right from the get-go, asking them about the design of the study, getting their input. And frankly, we've been doing this type of research for a few years now. And every time we do that, which is, we do it whenever we can, basically, unless a sponsor, for whatever reason, doesn't have the time, or, we'll always be suggesting that this is the best way of working. When you do, you get different and better results, frankly. And, even if you're an experienced researcher, if you're working in a particular indication, you can never second guess all of the aspects of how a disease or a treatment might impact a patient. So getting those insights into how you design the study is really valuable. And secondly, if you're doing a prospective study when you're asking patients to generate data themselves, patient-reported data, you might have electronic medical records data separately from clinicians. You want to, if you do that properly, you give yourself the best chance of getting really good engagement. And so, I think perhaps a good advice for folks isn't to think of what we're talking about as, a chore, lots of stuff that you need to do. Actually, it's an opportunity. Get that right. You can't guarantee you get good data, but you give yourself the best chance of getting it. And it opens up opportunities like, for instance, we've done studies where we're doing daily data capture, granular daily data capture. And, if you don't do all these things that I've mentioned, that's a struggle to do. But we've got studies where we've had excellent engagement on a daily basis if you do all these things right.
Which is absolutely invaluable data. Like you can't compete with that.
It opens up, as I said, it opens up opportunities. If you're in a you've got research questions which say require daily data capture, then you're not going to really be able to get that from patients when they visit their clinic, they visit their whatever it might be, their GP or their oncologist or whoever it might be. So you're going to be relying on patients themselves, generating data with a device of some sort and technology. We've got our own platform that enables us to do it in a really easy way, the electronic data capture. So if that's the route you're going down, you'd better make sure that you do it in a really engaging, patient-centric way, in a way that's rewarding for those participants, or they're not going to do it, frankly. They've got other things happening in that, we've all got other things happening in our lives.
It's a lot
harder. They've got a medical condition as well.
Yeah. Well, it makes sense. It's intuitive. You'd think the treatment that you're actually trying to develop, the reason why you're doing the study for the people you're doing it for, they should have advice on how it's actually being done, or they should have input. Like it doesn't seem like that much of an epiphany to consider that.
I agree with you. And, I think that in some ways the healthcare industry has been behind many other industries in the way we do our type of research. Now, some of that's understandable because there's a range of constraints around how one does engage with patients, participants, etc., from ethics and a compliance perspective. All understood. But nonetheless, if you were to explain some of these challenges to people who worked in other industries, they go, okay, hold on. So what you're saying is basically you should engage with your customer properly, or know your customer. I go, yeah.
No
go, well,
way.
that's pretty obvious, isn't it? So But again, the way to think about this is in terms of opportunities, because
Yeah.
actually with technology as well, we have more opportunities to engage with patients in a rewarding way for them. So when we started doing this type of research a few years ago, mobile phone technology, mobile phones are now far more powerful than they were a few years ago.
Yeah, absolutely.
Technology to generate data is far more flexible and easier than it used to be. So again, that opens up opportunities.
Yeah. Which is it's perfect tie into our next question. So it's fascinating that we can now turn this quality of life qualities into a hard mathematical variable, but there is a catch to get this high quality data. We're, like you said, increasingly relying on digital tools. And as we're moving towards patient-centered science, there's also a fear from some people, I would say, that we're creating elite patient science that includes the non-tech savvy. So how can we ensure that patient-centered science doesn't inadvertently become this elite patient science by unintentionally excluding those who either aren't tech savvy or who lack access to these high-end mobile devices or different technological?
Yeah, I mean, that's a great question. So, I mean, I think it's part of a broader question about biases. Now, we as scientists doing real-world research, we think about biases in studies the whole time. Now, in pretty much all studies, there are biases. And actually, one very simple one, which for the types of methodologies I've been talking about, is just, do you have a mobile phone? So basically, we've done some research in the past that's based on provision devices, and that has its place. But actually, since nearly everyone has a pretty powerful mobile phone in their pocket, we don't do too much provisions research now. But of course, the first bias you need to think about is, yes, nonetheless, it is everyone has to have a mobile phone. Now, there's not that many people who don't, but then the other bias, as you rightly say, is around literacy, tech literacy, etc. And, but I'd go back to the point I was making previously around the fact that technology is a lot better. Even though there might be some sophisticated tech happening in the background, part of that sophistication is a means of presenting a study in a very simple way to participants. So we're doing all the rigorous science piece in the background. We're using appropriate validated PRO measurement instruments. We've got a schedule of the administration of those that happens, and it's different for different instruments. But you don't need to worry about that. All you need to do as a patient is actually be ready to hopefully do the things you're asked to do when you receive some sort of notification. Yeah. But you're right. There are biases. So, but for me, the question isn't whether there are biases, because you can always make a list of biases. It's whether those biases prevent you from answering the research questions that you're interested in. So, and then from a pragmatic perspective as well, if one is also to offer, for instance, paper-based data capture as well, you can do that. But actually, increasingly, and again, it depends on the indication, etc. Right? Increasingly, that is an additional requirement in terms of time and resources, which you've got to make that trade-off. Okay, so if it is a particular issue, then we can do. But actually, and you talk to folks about this and say, well, actually, let's say we've got a particularly elderly cohort of patients. We often do work in conditions where particularly elderly, and they'll say, well, actually, we're doing all this stuff anyway. We're talking to our grandchildren on, WhatsApp the whole time. So, they might not be doing sort of clever blockchain or crypto stuff, but they're able. And again, back to what I was saying before, you don't need to have that level of expertise to participate in these types of studies if they're designed well.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think on the other hand, it could also be an equalizer in some ways, especially geographically, for people who maybe don't have the resources to go see their GP or to participate in a study where they would have to go into a hospital every single day. But if they have their phone in their back pocket,
absolutely,
it opens doors.
Yeah, so that's really important. So in the United States, we've got various studies that with our platform, basically, after people have gone through e-consent, they have the ability to share their EMR data. So we can import that directly into data lakes. And that means that basically anyone in the United States could be an eligible participant for a study. So, that means that actually we could have the ability to have a more representative cohort. So again, what's the choice? Doing something like that where people can self-refer. And typically we have different channels. So we might have some sites, we might have some recruitment by community physicians in the US, and we might have some decentralized. Now, I would say that in those types of studies, that's a key part of trying to reduce some biases, that if we were to only have some tertiary centres, then maybe the treatment patterns in those tertiary centres are very different from what's happening in other parts of the country.
Because then you keep going down the rabbit hole of potentially the type of person who would go into the hospital every day might have a different adherence to actually following the treatment than someone who maybe doesn't want to do that. You get into different behavioral patterns, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Yeah. No, and I think it's an interesting point. It's beyond just who we're reaching. It's about how we're actually watching them, and we are moving away from these occasional checkups towards something a lot more consistent. What has been the most surprising scientific insight that has only become visible once we've shifted to this continuous stream of real-time data?
Well, I'll give you an example. The study that I mentioned before, where we were working in a rare condition for a US sponsor, and they were interested in quantifying the impacts on patients, caregivers of transfusions.
Interesting.
And actually, in that situation, they had a hypothesis that transfusions impact patients in different ways, actually. So fatigue, quality of life, and a few other measures. But it's not just on the day of the transfusion. They thought, well, actually, when we talk to patients, sort of anecdotally, there's an impact leading up to the transfusion, day before, etc. And actually, things change on the day after, the 2 days after. So we put together this hypothesis that actually, if you're going to properly quantify this, you need to get this daily data capture to sort of check in on people a couple of days before, 3 days before the day of the transfusion, to build up this picture. And it's only when we did that that we were able to really, explore that hypothesis that we had. And of course, if you were going to do that with more traditional sampling methodologies, where you'd maybe see the patient on the transfusion day, but then ask them to recall what happened in previous days, again, you might get recall biases, etc. So it was really exciting doing that, because we had, collectively we had this sort of hypothesis, and the data come and you go, look, it works very nicely. Now, of course, we can never guarantee that things work nicely, but that's a really nice example of where actually technology and working in a patient-centric way is a real enabler. That couldn't have been done previously.
Yeah, no, that's a great analogy. And lastly, I'm curious, when patients are involved in the actual design of research protocols, how does that specifically improve the scientific output? I know you've touched on that a bit. And does it primarily reduce attrition, or does it fundamentally change the hypotheses and what we should actually be testing?
It can, and that's really what I was saying before, why it's so fundamentally important, because it can affect all of those things. It can affect the way one designs the study. So if you go into a study with an idea to measure, let's just say burden of disease in a very, I know it's an umbrella term in a broad way.
Sure.
then sponsor or clinicians as well, and clinicians expert in the indications, but even they may not be corrected in some way by actually how it works out when you talk to patients. So it can be, from a design perspective, it can be things like prioritizing the types of domains of data that we're interested in. So often there's a trade-off, right? You might think, well, ideally, we as scientists, we want really granular data temporally, okay, in terms of administration schedule. But actually, because we can, perhaps there's a whole range of different domains of data that we're interested in capturing each time. So maybe it's things, it could quality of life, it could be pain, it could be fatigue, it could be sleep, it could be health resources, whatever it might be. That could be a lot of stuff. And so actually working with patients to sort of prioritize the importance of that can be really important. Okay, so if you try and go too deep and get too much out of the patient, then you risk overburdening them, and they think, "Oh, I'm not going to do this. This is too much. I've got other stuff going on." So fundamentally, you can have the patients help you design the study and prioritize as best you can. Then, if that and other techniques that you might use in terms of compensating them, in terms of giving them feedback about how their voice, their input has been valuable from a science perspective. If you do all of those things, absolutely, they give you the best chance of getting really good data over time. And as I said, we can get, you can't guarantee that, but we often get really good engagement rates. 80-90% of the stuff we're asking people to do, they do. And if you're doing it over extended time periods, that can be, historically, you get many people get pretty big drop-off rates, which is a real problem. If you get a big drop-off, you've got nothing. Yeah,
then you're screwed. No, I think that collaborative aspect is a really big piece of it as well. I think people like to feel included. Not it separates the, okay, you're just part of this study. It's the divide. Whereas I think when people actually feel like their voices are being heard, they're getting to make an impact, they're getting to shape something that they care about, because obviously they're impacted by whatever disease you're studying. I think it means a lot to them as well.
Yeah, look, as I said, we will compensate people for their time. The Amazon vouchers, that sort of thing, for doing our studies. But the vast majority of the people, that's not what motivates. I mean, that's a good starting point. That's not what motivates, and they're motivated by the understanding that they have a particular condition, that they have an opportunity to play a part in research. Perhaps again, those opportunities didn't exist a few years ago. So in the right framework, in the right conditions, they're happy. They're often happy to do that. But one part of that actually is, if you're closing the loop, is giving them feedback as well. So think about in some ways an informal contract with us. We're saying we've got the research. They say, well, I'll give you my data. I'll share my EMR data. Tell me how it went. Tell me that I was able to help improve research. Tell me what you found that I contributed to, how that helped advance care. And it's not selfish. It's not really about their care. They recognise typically that that's probably the future, but to help other people in their situation.
No, that's incredible, and a perfect way to end. Thank you so much, Mark. It's been it's been absolutely fantastic talking to you again, and invaluable to hear your insights.
Yeah, well, thanks for the invitation. Nice to talk.
If you enjoyed this conversation, don't forget to subscribe and leave us a review. It helps more listeners like you find the show. Want more HUR, RWE, and market access insights? Stay connected with Theoretically Speaking and HealthEconomics.com for the latest trends shaping healthcare decision-making. Until then, keep asking the big questions, challenging assumptions, and driving smarter healthcare decisions. Thanks for listening. I'm your host, Paige McGarry, and we'll see you next time.